Parashat Re'eh, this week's Torah portion, is a really challenging parasha. One of its main concerns is building metaphorical walls around the Israelite community, both to shield it from outside influences and threats, and also to create a certain uniformity from within. People, for example, are to offer their sacrifices at a certain place, at certain times, in certain ways. The Israelites, another example, are to obliterate any evidence of previous ways of worshiping gods in the land that they are entering. The list of foods that they may eat and not eat is lengthy and specific, probably deterring Israelites from breaking bread with non-Israelites. The rules are so difficult to follow. On the one hand, the mindset of this parasha is very compelling. It is preservative. It establishes boundaries within which the community can thrive, and it minimizes risks. On the other hand, the strictness and even ruthlessness in some cases with which such laws would need to be followed challenges the ethical society that the Torah instructs the Israelites to build. There is clear differentiation in this parasha, for example, about how Israelites and non-Israelites are to be treated. There is clear resistance within it to creativity or organic leadership or diversity. This Torah portion invites pressing and difficult questions about how we survive without sacrificing who we are. And that's what threats to survival do. In any case, they push us to our limits, and they test our values, and they strip us of pretense. They reveal who we are at our core. One passage in this parasha is a microcosm of this set of questions. Deuteronomy 14 begins this way. You are children of Adonai, your God. You shall not gash yourselves or shave the front of your heads because of the dead. You shall not gash yourselves or shave your heads in front of the dead because of the dead. What does this mean? Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writes that this verse, while having a long history and lots of varied readings, is at the simplest level about mourning practices in the ancient world. There is evidence inside the Bible and also elsewhere of ancient Near Eastern mourning activities that included a certain amount of self-mutilation. So the Torah is instructing the Israelites not to engage in those, that violence against the self and corruption of who you are is not a productive way to face death or loss. Rather, as we know, Judaism has developed a very clear set of guidelines surrounding how we mourn loss of loved ones, a path that prescribes a period of time between death and burial, the 7 days following burial, Shiva, the month of Shloshim, and the entire year after a loved one's death. All of those times as being sacred and unique in our journeys. And we have in our very chapel tonight people at each one of those stages and beyond. This path that is carved out by our tradition helps us find space and time to acknowledge our pain, but also it stands in stark contrast to what the Torah perceives as perhaps rash or violent, spontaneous, and excessive practices that it was referring to other groups doing. Judaism's mourning practices exist in harmony with psychological research about the ways people go through stages of grief. And in my experience as a rabbi, I humbly share with you, as you have so graciously shared with me, that when someone is not able to go through a thoughtful and steady cycle of mourning, healing sometimes feels very hard to get to. There is a sense of incompleteness and festering, as if an open wound has been left untreated. We are very blessed to have such a rich heritage in the ways of death and mourning in our community. But this verse about not gashing ourselves in the face of death, in face of mourning, I think can also be read allegorically, symbolically, to apply not to the individual, but to the entire people. This Torah portion is telling the story of a people who feel extremely vulnerable trying to stand on their own and be autonomous, even though their parents, their grandparents, and 20 generations of their family have only ever known slavery and torment. They have no model for the life they're trying to build. Might one of the voices in this Torah portion then be, the subtext is, we must trust no one. We fear becoming slaves again. We have no home or sense of security, so we build high, strong walls around us and carve out a narrow space where no one can touch us again. But in doing so, might the Israelites also be losing who they are, or who they want to be, in the face of unspeakable pain and loss that they have sustained, a metaphorical gashing. Just as individuals are instructed to intentionally go through this process of healing after the trauma of loss, so too must the community. For we, descendants of the Israelites, have sustained loss too. We stand here in 2018 grappling with the annihilation of 1/3 of world Jewry in the lifetime of many sitting in this chapel. With broken chains of song and cuisine and language and culture and stories and prayers, not to mention family and friends, that millennia of wandering and permanent refugee status has wrought. This is part of who we are as a people. What might it mean not to gash ourselves before this kind of loss? That we not let our communal pain be the most visible thing about us? That we not live in fear? That we not sacrifice the essence of who we are? A nation of people committed to the sanctification of holy times and the endurance of tradition and ritual and the building of an ethical society. If this dynamic is at least one of the motivating factors of Jewish communal behavior, even today, how do we follow the spirit of this Torah's law? That we approach mourning and sadness and loss and pain without hysteria, with a space for emotion, but a rejection of self-mutilation and fragmentation. We are now a year since the Nazi and white supremacist demonstrations in Charlottesville that terrorized not only that town, but every minority at whom their hate was aimed. And there is an impulse inside our community to shut our doors and to take cover and to pull back and to metaphorically build walls, a spiritual gashing because of the deep losses we've sustained in the past, of which this is reminiscent. And this reaction is understandable and even reasonable. But there is also a beautiful impulse in us to temper that response and to breathe and to acknowledge that we have scarred hearts and scarred spirits as Jews. And in spite of it, to keep walking gingerly toward our rightful place in community as full partners and neighbors and friends with all justice-loving people. Our Haftorah portion of consolation says this week, Bitzdaka tikonani. It is through our righteous living that we will be reestablished and rebuilt after trauma. Whether in the time of Moses, as our Torah portion locates us, or the time of Isaiah, where those words come from, in the camps or amidst rockets, and after personal loss too. Our tradition asserts that our steadfast footsteps on the path of tradition and hopefulness in a bright future is what brings us out of the valley of the shadow of death and into the light. So for all those mourning a loss this week, and for our entire community mourning a loss of the security that we wish we had, that we strive to rebuild, may this be our prayer, that we shall walk steadfast toward the light out of the valley of the shadow of death. Amen.